位观众大家好，我是于文琪。今天我们很荣幸能请到美国前驻俄罗斯大使以及现任史丹佛大学教授 McFaul 来跟我们讲解乌俄战争。Ambassador McFaul, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
You're one of the world's leading experts on Russia, and were intimately involved in U.S.-Russia relations, both at President Obama's White House and as the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. Can you help us understand why did Russia invade Ukraine? And what is inside Putin's head? What is his end goal?
Well, first, thanks for having me. Second, those are really hard questions you asked right away, and I'll have difficulty answering, but let me try because they're the most essential questions. First, with respect to why this war and why now, I think there's a common misperception, at least here in the United States, sometimes in Europe, that this was Putin's response to NATO expansion or threat from the West, and that he had to invade. This is what he says on his propaganda channels to stop the West from threatening Russia. I don't think that has anything to do with his real motivations. His real motivation, and let me explain. NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO has never attacked Russia or the Soviet Union. NATO, as an organization I know well, would never attack Russia. That would be crazy to do so. And President Biden, somebody who I worked with for when he was the vice president, and I've spoken to him a few times since he's been president, has no intention to threaten Russian security, nor does any other country in Europe. What threatens Mr. Putin is not NATO expansion, it's democratic expansion. Which is to say that the tensions in U.S.-Russian relations from when I was in the government and even before during the Bush administration years were never triggered by NATO. They were triggered by democratic breakthroughs. So first in Georgia, 2003, then Ukraine, the Orange Revolution in 2004. Then when I was in the government, the Arab Spring in 2011. And then there were massive demonstrations in Russia itself in 2011, 2012. And then another round of demonstrations for pro-democracy demonstrations in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014, which led, and that eventually succeeded. And Mr. Putin's ally there, Mr. Yanukovych, fled. And that was when he first invaded, was in response to that mobilization of Ukrainian society, who, by the way, didn't want to join NATO. They wanted to join the European Union. And ever since then, since 2014, Putin has been trying to undermine Ukrainian democracy, using money, using occupied territories, supporting separatists in the eastern part of Ukraine, annexing Crimea. And then finally, I think he just became frustrated with his inability to undermine democracy through those means, and he decided to invade. And he was very clear about his objectives. He said to denazify the Ukrainian government, so that's a code word for regime change, and to destroy the capacity of the Ukrainian military. Thankfully, he hasn't achieved either of those two objectives yet, but the war rages on.
So why is this in Russia's interest? I mean, if he's so concerned about democratic values in Ukraine, that's in another country. Or do you think in his mind, he's still trying to control Ukraine in some way?
Both. It's a great question again. Now, from my point of view, my personal point of view, I want to be very clear. I don't think this war is in Russia's national interest. If I were advising the president of Russia, a different president, I would say, why are we invading Ukraine? Why are we killing ethnic Russians? Remember, Putin is killing ethnic Russians, civilians. He's doing very little fighting against the Ukrainian army. He's mostly bombing Russian cities, Ukrainian cities in the east, and that's where the biggest population concentrations of ethnic Russians live. So I don't think that's in Russia's national interest. They're losing lots of soldiers. They're exposing to the world that the Russian military is not as mighty as they claimed to be before the war. And then on top of that, in response, there's been comprehensive, massive sanctions against Russia that is making all Russians worse off. So I think it's very irrational to have invaded Ukraine. And I think it'll go down in history as a great overreach, overextension that will be very detrimental to Russia itself. And by the way, that reminds me of overreach during the Soviet Union days, when in the 1970s, Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, had a bunch of wins where it felt like communism was on the march, right? Marxist-Leninist regimes were taking over. They took over in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam, then Angola and Mozambique, and then finally even in Nicaragua in Latin America. And he thought that history was on his side. And that's when he decided to invade Afghanistan. And that was a giant strategic mistake that helped to unravel the Soviet Union. He overreached. Autocrats overreach. And I see a certain similarity with Putin, right? His first war was in Chechnya. He won that war inside the Russian Federation. Then he invaded Georgia, 2008. Then he attacked Ukraine for the first time in 2014. Then he used his air force to prop up Mr. Assad in Syria and succeeded. And then he overreached in Ukraine, just like Brezhnev did. And I think this will be the beginning of the end for Putinism inside Russia. So I think it was highly irrational for him to launch this war.
So in some way, Mr. Putin seems to have misunderstood or misread the situation. But on the other hand, do you think we have also, on the West side, misread or underestimated President Putin?
Yes, both are true. Not President Biden, I want to be clear about that. His intelligence services, and I give them a lot of credit, predicted that this war would be big when the rest of the world was saying it wouldn't happen. You know, my impression is that most European leaders didn't expect it to be this big. I don't think Xi Jinping thought it was going to be this big, and they all miscalculated how long the war would go on. I think we did too, by the way, on that. I think we underestimated the Ukrainian military and overestimated the Russian military. And there's a lesson for everybody about that. When you're fighting to defend your territory, it's hard to measure will, right? The will to fight. We can count tanks. We can count soldiers. We can count how much this government spends on its military. But the will to fight when you're defending your own territory, that's something that's hard to quantify. And I think Putin got that really, really wrong. But I do think we underestimated his ability to use his willingness to use force. I think we underestimated his evilness. I want to be clear. I did too. I have been writing articles about Mr. Putin for 22 years. I wrote my first article warning the world about growing autocracy inside Russia back in March of 2000. And yet, I want to be honest with you, I never expected that he would use such horrific tactics in this war against Ukraine, this slaughtering of innocent civilians. I think we all underestimated his willingness to use these kinds of evil methods for fighting this war.
Yeah, the war has truly upended the world. It has also united the West and revitalized the NATO.
Yes.
While we have, imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia, can we do more? I mean, how can we stop the killing of so many in Ukraine? It is very hard for anyone to watch what's really happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, let me get to that. But you reminded me of one other piece I forgot about, the irrationality of Putin's war. because Putin, one of his objectives was to weaken NATO. He's talked about that. And, when President Trump was our president, they were cooperating to try, they both thought that maybe NATO wasn't needed. But what has this war done? As you rightly pointed out, it's united NATO in a way that it has not been united for a long, long time. And now there's even talk in Sweden and Finland that they might join NATO. So that's irrational if you're Putin. And I think we need to understand that his strategy is backfiring here. It's not succeeding. But you asked a hard question about what more could be done. My answer to that is I'm very impressed with what President Biden has done to lead the free world in strengthening NATO, putting sanctions on Russia, and giving military assistance to Ukraine. I think it's been very admirable what he's done. And at the same time, I want him to do more every single week. More weapons and more sanctions in particular. This war will only end if there is a stalemate on the battlefield. Right now, there's not a stalemate on the battlefield. Putin is still making gains. And so I think we need to give Ukraine everything that we can so that they can fight to bring a stalemate on the battlefield. And once that happens, then I think you'll see serious peace talks.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are wondering, why is the West sort of sitting and watching while saying the West is providing a lot of support, but not getting involved militarily? And so, there is some cynicism, I would say, especially in other parts of the world, about whether the West is just talking, but not really acting to provide the support. And so that has also created, I would say, some fissures between the West and the rest of the world. So, do you think this is, in some way, the war has made the world even more divided? And you have said that, and we all agree, this has united the West, but this seems to have divided the West from the rest of the world.
Yes, it's a great observation. And I would say two things to that point. First, the autocrats of the world have become more united too. I am struck by how supportive Xi Jinping has been of Vladimir Putin. He could have been more neutral. I think he could have staked out a different position, but he's chosen to really support Vladimir Putin. And other autocrats are doing that too. Mr. Lukashenko in Belarus, for instance. You see unity there. And then you see...
But you also have India.
Well, I was going to get to India. India has been most disappointing to me of all the countries in the world, because India is a democracy. India works with the United States on the Quad, as you know well. President Biden has made a big bet on the Quad, strengthening the democracies in Asia. And yet India, when push comes to shove, has been neutral in this war. I think it's a strategic mistake. And I'm frankly disappointed that India does not understand that what Ukraine is fighting for, it's a war of decolonization. Remember, it was called the Russian Empire. They brought in pieces like Ukraine into their empire. And I would hope that countries like India that fought for their own independence would be more sympathetic to other countries seeking decolonization. That's exactly what this is. This is a case of decolonization or recolonization from the empire. That's what Putin is trying to do. And then in addition to that, you have lots of countries in the Middle East in particular that are just kind of standing and waiting and not taking one side or the other. And I would hope that we would continue to work to help those countries understand that this is not just a fight between two European countries far away. This is a fight between a colonial power and a former colony, and a dictatorship versus a democracy. And if the dictator wins and the colonial power wins, I think that is bad for all democracies in the world and all countries that are fighting against colonialism.
That's a compelling argument. Let's come to the economic sanctions. Energy prices are up and inflation rate is at like 8.5% in March in the US, the worst in almost 40 years. So it is a very hard job for President Biden to explain this war to the American people, why they need to make those sacrifices while not really seeing the war ending in sight. And former, U.S. Secretary of Treasury, Larry Summers, whom you probably know, said recently that if this is the worst threat in 75 years of naked aggression, people need to be willing to not have air conditioning or wear more sweaters when the weather is cool. And the U.S. needs to deploy more economic tools. So the ruble is actually in free fall, not sort of this back in the level of pre-invasion. And there should be more Russian bank defaults, more seizures of Russian assets. So this leads to this question. Should the US designate Russia a state sponsor of terrorism means more sanctions? Your view?
Yes. I think the United States should. I think other countries should as well. I think tragically, there's not any difference in my mind between watching what Putin is doing, using his weaponry, his killing machine to slaughter civilians in Mariupol, and what Al-Qaeda did to my country on September 11th, 2001. The only difference is one is a state and one's not, but the methods are very similar. So I think that is legitimate. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a legal expert, but on the policy side, I think that is the case. And secondly, to the point about what Larry Summers meant, I agree. I think we need to sacrifice more to help the Ukrainians win this war. And I think politicians need to make those arguments, and they need to lead on those arguments. I sometimes say politicians react to polls, leaders shape polls. And I think on this issue, if leaders would explain to the American people, the German people, the French people, that yes, prices are going up, but they're going up because our way of life is being threatened here. Mm-hmm. And if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he'll keep threatening the rest of the democratic world. It won't just stop in Ukraine. So I think the stakes are pretty high, and I think smart, principled politicians need to explain those stakes to their constituents.
Taiwan. Taiwanese people pay very close attention to the war in Ukraine because Taiwan feels a close affinity to Ukraine because it faces a very similar threatening neighbor that basically denies the island's right to existence and democracy. So what do you think China is thinking right now, watching this war?
Well, that's a good question. I don't want to pretend to be a specialist on China, although I'm writing a book about U.S.-China-Russia relations right now. I would say a couple of things that they should be thinking about. I mentioned that Brezhnev era, right, in the 70s. And if you go back and you read the archives of the Politburo back then of the Soviet Union, they had the impression that America was, not only was communism on the march, but America was in decline. And remember, in the late 60s, we had a lot of turmoil domestically in the United States over civil rights, over the war. We then had scandals leading to the resignation of Mr. Nixon. And it looked like we were a society divided. We looked like we were weak, and the Soviet Union was rising. And we now know that that's when Mr. Brezhnev overreached, invaded Afghanistan. And that invasion was one of the triggers that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It took many years, but it was the beginning of the end. And I hope that Chinese Communist Party leaders in Beijing are studying those lessons and learning those lessons and avoiding overreach. Because sometimes when I hear them speak and when I hear their surrogates speak, it sounds a lot like Soviet leaders in the 70s, where they're talking about we are rising, America's in decline. And I would just say, hold on to your horses here. I've heard this, I've seen this story before. China has a long ways to go before they catch up to the United States in terms of GDP per capita. China has no allies in the world to speak of. The vast majority of the people in the world support democratic ideas over autocratic ideas. I think it's way too premature to start to believe the things you put on your propaganda, which is that the United States is in decline. And I think that is a lesson that they should learn with respect to that old period. And the second lesson they should learn is about what we were talking about earlier, counting up the number of tanks, counting up the number of weapons and the number of ships and the number of soldiers. When you do that, the United States, China, and Russia are the three largest militaries in the world by far. And on certain dimensions, Russia is even ahead of China. United States is number one, China number two, Russia number three. And yet, look at what's going on. The alleged number three military in the world, if you just count up the numbers, the number of tanks and missiles and money spent and number of soldiers, is being defeated right now by the Ukrainian military. That if you just count up their soldiers and weapons, should have been defeated long ago. And I hope Chinese leaders are looking at that when they think about using military force against Taiwan. Taiwan, after all, is way better armed than Ukraine was. And the military relationship between the United States and Taiwan is much more robust than it is between Ukraine and the United States. And then the second lesson I hope Chinese leaders are watching is what's happened with respect to sanctions. It's been, the sanctions have been amazing. 500 companies have pulled out of Russia. 500 mostly Western companies have pulled out of Russia. And remember, Russia is an economy that is way less integrated than the Chinese economy is in the international world. And number two, they have a direct source of income, the export of oil and gas, that China does not have. And yet, these sanctions are having a big effect on the Russian economy. And I hope Chinese leaders are looking at the solidarity you've seen around the world for sanctions and doing the calculations. In my view, Mr. Putin grossly miscalculated. He thought it was going to be an easy war. He thought the West would not unite, and he didn't expect the sanctions. And I hope that Chinese leaders are studying those very important lessons as they unfold.
Yeah, it certainly has gotten more attention to what's going to happen in Taiwan. So the White House also just announced another round of military arms sales. So last question, how would the war end in your prediction?
Wars tend to end in just two ways. Either one side wins or there's a stalemate on the battlefield. I do not see a scenario where Russia can win anymore. They don't have enough resources. They don't have enough soldiers left. They cannot occupy all of Ukraine. And if they tried, they would be fighting a partisan war against their soldiers for years and decades to come. So I don't see that happening. I think it's more likely than the first scenario, but still unlikely that Ukraine defeats all of the Russian soldiers that are currently occupying Russian territory. By that, I mean,
including in the west, including in the east, the Donbass.
Yes, including Donbass, including Crimea. I think it's more likely than the first scenario of Russia winning. but I still think it's a major military task that they would be able to push the Russian army out of Donbass and especially Crimea. That is a major, major war that would last for a long, long time. Not out of the question, but unlikely. And therefore, I think the most likely scenario is that there will be a stalemate on the battlefield, and then that creates the conditions for a negotiated end to this war. But to achieve that, the West has to continue to arm Ukraine. They do not have the weapons right now to achieve stalemate on the battlefield. And that's why the Western world, actually the entire world, not just the Western world, should do all they can to give the Ukrainians the arms that they need to defeat Putin's invading army.
Well, thank you. Certainly, I think Ukrainian people's courage has truly moved so many of us in the rest of the world. 感谢大使给我们今天精彩的分析，让我们更了解俄乌战争的背景以及美国的政策。Thank you, Ambassador McFaul, for being with us today. Let's hope the war ends soon, so you can come back and talk about your book to TVBS and discuss other important topics. Take care.
Thanks for having me. 谢谢。
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you later. Bye-bye.